Hello, welcome to Washington Talk. I'm Young-Kyo Kim. It's been only 2 weeks into the new year, but things are moving fast. North Korea fired missiles for the third time of the year after criticizing the U.S. for announcing sanctions and proposing more sanctions by the UN Security Council. Today we'll discuss these and more. Joining me is Scott Snyder. Mr. Snyder is Senior Fellow for Korea Studies and Director of U.S.-Korea Policy at the Council on Foreign Relations. His book, South Korea at the Crossroads, examines the trajectory of South Korean foreign policy. Ian Williams is also with me today. Mr. Williams is Deputy Director of the Missile Defense Project at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. He's also the Managing Editor of the CSIS website Missile Threat, which carries analysis on missile proliferation and defense systems. Welcome to the show. Thank you both for being with us today.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you.
Well, first of all, a lot has happened since the beginning of the year. So we're going to break down one by one. North Korea launched missiles 3 times now, and those missiles include what North Korea claims to be hypersonic. Mr. Williams, how do you assess those missile capabilities?
Well, what we've seen from North Korea this month are 2 tests of ballistic missiles that are equipped with what we call a maneuvering reentry vehicle. And what this means is that the missile will fly initially along a straight trajectory like we've seen in the past, but late in the missile's flight, as it re-enters the atmosphere, it will engage in some maneuvers. In the 2 tests we've seen so far this year of this weapon, the warheads took a sharp turn either to the left or to the right after it re-entered the atmosphere. Now, I would personally not classify these weapons as hypersonic weapons in the way that we have typically classified that class of system, because they don't spend most of their time in the atmosphere. If you look at the kinds of hypersonic weapons that China has been testing, that Russia has been testing, these are distinctive in that they can maintain hypersonic speeds, which is faster than Mach 5, while staying in the atmosphere. These weapons that North Korea tested only spent a short time in the atmosphere and are only able to do some limited maneuvers in the very late stages of the flight. Now, nevertheless, it is a novel, unique capability that they have. This is something that we have seen them test maneuvering reentry vehicles a little bit in the past. This is the most sophisticated version of it that we've seen them test so far. So it does represent, I would say, a new capability.
Mm-hmm. Mr. Snyder, what do you think this recent missile test tells us in terms of North Korea's missile technology?
Well, I agree with what Ian has said about the maneuverability. The other aspect of the test that the North Koreans advertised was a new fueling system. And so that represents, I think, a step forward. And I mean, North Korea is gradually improving and testing these new capabilities under the rubric of the label hypersonic that they gave to it last year in the conclusion of the Workers' Party Congress. And so to that extent, it represents gradual progress toward achieving the objective that the North Koreans have set out for themselves.
Mm-hmm. When it comes to the assessment of the North Korean missiles, what North Korea claimed was very different from what the South Korean military estimated. For example, for the second missile test, North Korea said the missile flew 1,000 kilometers, which is comparable to what the South Korean military estimated as more than 700 kilometers, which is a pretty big gap. Mr. Williams, why is there this kind of a gap between what North Korea claims and what South Korea estimates?
Mm-hmm. I think the most likely explanation is that the radars used to track the missile during the beginning of its flight probably lost sight of it once it dropped down and re-entered the atmosphere and started engaging in these maneuvers. And that really speaks to the challenge of this kind of weapon, that it's difficult to track. in their late stages as they drop down to a lower altitude, and they're hard to predict where they're going. You can think that they're headed for one place, and then it will engage in these late stage maneuvers and will veer off towards a different target. So what I think that what explains the difference is that what we saw on radar was a ballistic missile that was following a ballistic trajectory. And then once it fell off radar, it started engaging in maneuvers, which I think is which we didn't see. So I think that's the most likely explanation for the difference.
Right. Mr. Snyder, do you think there's some aspect here of North Korea overplaying it and South Korea downplaying it?
Perhaps. I think that the North Koreans do want to portray these tests as successes, and the gap in assessment between North and South Korea on the first test, also raised in my mind the possibility that the first test actually did not perform up to the level of expectation that the North Koreans had hoped. But I think that what Ian points to with regard to the radar tracking capability is very interesting, because it shows that the tests are not just tests of the missiles, but they also are tests of the respective tracking capabilities that each country has. And it's an interesting question to what extent North Korea learns from the assessments, the external assessments that are being offered alongside their own internal assessments.
Mm-hmm. According to the North Korean media, leader Kim Jong-un observed some of these missile launches. Mr. Snyder, does this indicate this missile launch was that important for the regime?
I do think that Kim Jong-un's return to the missile testing site suggests that this is, again, a leadership priority, as we saw back in 2017, and it raises prospects for a confrontational phase as North Korea continues to move in this direction. The other issue I think that it highlights is that in the context of poor economic performance, Kim Jong-un may have to lean harder on military capabilities and progress as a source of legitimation and as evidence of progress in terms of achieving his own internal objectives.
Mm-hmm. Obviously, North Korea is building up its threats against neighboring countries. Mr. Williams, can South Korea and Japan defend themselves from this kind of missiles?
Well, unfortunately, the answer is kind of complicated. It's sort of yes and no. So in the beginning of the missile's flight, it behaved just like an ordinary ballistic missile. So that is vulnerable to normal ballistic missile defenses. Where things got complicated was at the end of their flight when they started maneuvering, in which case it would be more challenging to intercept them because it's hard to predict where they're going to go. So it's hard to get your interceptor to where it needs to be. So if I was looking at this problem, where would I want to start beefing up my defenses? Probably investing in missile defense systems that are capable of engaging missiles outside of the atmosphere earlier in a missile's flight, where it's easier to intercept. And I would also be looking at other kinds of sensors that are not on the ground, right? The radar that lost track of these things was probably a sea-based or a ground-based radar that's very limited in its view because it can't see over the horizon. I would want to start looking at a lot more airborne sensors, airborne radars, and other kinds of sensors that can see much further and can see lower altitude threats, and start integrating them into my early warning systems. So yes, it is possible to defend against these things, but we may need to start looking at adjustments to our overall posture.
Mm-hmm. Mr. Williams, just to make sure that I understood what you just said, do you mean that South Korea and Japan should be able to respond to the missile as soon as it was launched?
Well, they need to be able to engage the missile earlier in their flight, which means, yes, they would need to be able to detect them a little bit earlier and to be able to fire your interceptors a little bit earlier. There's a lot of the systems that we have in region are what we call point defenses, which use short-range interceptors that will engage a missile very late in its flight. And that's a much more challenging shot when you're looking at these maneuvering reentry vehicles, because you don't quite know where they're going to go, right? They become unpredictable. And unpredictable threats are challenges to ballistic missile defense systems. So, if I wanted to emphasize where should new investment in defenses go, it would be longer range interceptors, faster interceptors, and sensors that are capable of seeing these things and keeping a track of them throughout their flight.
I see. Mr. Williams, one more question here. Some U.S. flights on the West Coast were grounded right after the second missile launch. We are not too sure whether this move was related to North Korea's missile launch, but there are some news reports that it was the reaction to the missile launch. Does this mean that these missile technologies obtained by the North Korea can pose a threat to the U.S. mainland as well?
Not as they're currently configured. The missiles that North Korea fired this month do not have anywhere near the range to reach the U.S. mainland. So I'm not quite sure why the U.S. FAA reacted that way. It was if it was in reaction to the missile test, it was probably a mistake, but there was certainly not a need to ground aircraft on the West Coast in response to this test.
And now we'll continue with how the current situation is unfolding. The United States rather immediately responded by imposing sanctions on the North Korean individuals involved in the weapons programs. And the U.S. didn't stop there. It proposed additional UN Security Council sanctions against North Korea. And in an apparent act of defiance, North Korea conducted this year's third missile test. Mr. Snyder, what are we seeing here? Is the U.S. going back to a textbook approach when dealing with North Korea's weapons activities?
Well, to some extent, you could say that, but one of the main changes in the textbook has been the receptivity of the UN Security Council to the imposition of penalties on North Korea. And I think that both in the Security Council and through the experts group, it's simply going to be harder and more unlikely for the U.S. to be able to achieve a multilateral sanctions, addition of multilateral sanctions on North Korea. And so the fallback ends up being the imposition of unilateral sanctions on North Korean entities. And it appears that this round of sanctions particularly targeted the North Korean missile supply chain.
Mr. Snyder, this was the first move in a while for the U.S. government to respond to North Korea's short-range missiles. Why do you think it was different this time? Is this in line with what Secretary Blinken said, that there will be repercussions and consequences for these actions by North Korea?
Well, I think that's what the United States government wanted to show, is that there are repercussions, but the imposition of the Treasury sanctions have always involved a lag time in terms of designating individuals, because there is a level of evidence that is required in terms of evasion activities that has to be supplied in order to justify the designation. And so what caught my eye in the listing of these designations was the reference to past sanctions evasion activity related specifically to North Korea's missile development and individuals who had been involved in that activity.
Mm-hmm. Mr. Williams, does this indicate the U.S. is taking more seriously about the technological advancement of the North Korean missiles?
Yeah, well, the United States needs to take it seriously. What we see with with Kim Jong-un, unlike his father and his grandfather, is that these missiles are not for show. These tests are not just for show. That what Kim Jong-un is doing is building a very credible, very potent war-fighting apparatus in order to prosecute and engage and possibly even win a conflict on the Korean Peninsula. I also think it's good that the United States is taking this action, these sanctions actions against North Korea for these tests. Something that we saw with the Trump administration is that there seemed to be this distinction between short-range tests and long-range tests, right? That short-range tests were okay, and the Trump administration largely ignored them, except for long-range tests, intercontinental ballistic missiles that could target the United States. That was unacceptable, while it largely ignored the short-range test, which threatens South Korea, Japan, U.S. allies. And I think it's important that the Biden administration takes this action in response to these short-range tests, saying that these missiles threaten our allies, threaten U.S. forces in the region, and this is not okay.
A diplomatic source told VOA the UN sanctions the U.S. is proposing is about the individuals on whom the U.S. government already imposed sanctions. Mr. Snyder, does this have any practical impact when the sanctions are only limited to individuals?
Well, yeah, I think it has a practical impact because the U.S. is sending a message about the reputational consequences of dealing with bad actors in North Korea. And it's also signaling resolve to potentially take enforcement actions against individuals through the U.S. justice system.
Mr. Williams, will this have any ramifications for North Korea's weapons program?
I mean, potentially in the short term, if the sanctions have some effect of limiting their access to certain materials from abroad, but I imagine the North Koreans would be able to adapt to that really quickly and reestablish those lines of those supply lines. I also think that it's very likely at this point, if you look at the swiftness of the North Korean advancements, I think it's very likely that they're getting some support from a state actor, potentially Russia. And when you have that kind of support, it's easier to find new sources for the materials that you need. So it may have some short-term impact, but I think it's largely, as Scott said, largely reputational, largely symbolic. Still important, but probably won't slow them down much in terms of missile development.
If I could just highlight one additional aspect of the U.S. response, not this week, but that you've covered last month in your interview with General Abrams, is that the U.S. has to incorporate the response to North Korean missile improvements in strategic planning guidance and in war plans that haven't been updated for some time. But it's very clear that the intent to make those revisions is driven by North Korean improvements.
Mm-hmm. And plus, the United States is working so that the sanctions will be designated by the Sanctions Committee rather than through a resolution, since the resolution will not likely pass because of the opposition from China and Russia. And even the designation by committee seems difficult because it requires consensus. Mr. Snyder, Secretary Blinken said the U.S. is working closely with allies and partners. Is there a possibility that the U.S. could ask the allies to impose their own unilateral sanctions?
I think there is a possibility that allies might be encouraged to take their own unilateral sanctions actions. I don't think the U.S. can make that demand. And in this respect, I would note that in the U.S.-Japan 2+2, one of the items that came out from that statement was the need to respond to North Korean hypersonic capabilities. And I'm not sure whether this is going to involve a research component or some particular set of countermeasures, but I think that it's notable that that appeared as part of the statements coming from the U.S.-Japan 2+2.
Mm-hmm. And my last question for today. Right after warning that it'll take stronger and certain reaction to the US push for sanctions, North Korea launched another set of missiles, as we all know. Mr. Snyder, is the circumstance turning into a tense standoff between the two countries?
I think we're clearly moving back into a confrontational phase between the US and North Korea. Both countries really face irreconcilable differences between the North Korean assertion that it has a right to self-defense and that it's going to be a responsible nuclear state, and the US and international community's assessment that North Korea is an illegal nuclear state.
Mr. Williams, do you expect to see further provocations from North Korea?
Certainly would expect them to continue missile testing this year, and it's possible we could even see some nuclear activity. North Korea restarted its nuclear reactor last year, so it is producing fissile material. So it will be interesting to see what they do with that. If they are working on some new warhead designs, if they would test those. I would also expect to see other kinds of weapons tests as well, things like cruise missiles. We saw a cruise missile test recently. I would expect to see them testing those more, as well as more ballistic missiles, and possibly even more long-range missiles. We have not seen an intercontinental ballistic missile test since 2017. It's with a new administration, new U.S. administration. It's possible that North Korea will want to test how the Biden administration would respond to that kind of action.
Secretary of State Tony Blinken said he thinks these missile tests are partly North Korea trying to get attention. While it's anybody's guess how far North Korea is willing to go, the State Department made it clear that the U.S. has a number of tools in its arsenal to hold North Korea accountable for its actions. We'll have to see how the U.S. will use these tools in order to contain North Korea's provocations. Mr. Williams and Mr. Snyder, thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And that does it for this week's Washington Talk from Voice of America. Please join us again next week for more analysis.